The colony on Titan had been in full swing for 2 Earth years. Towering spires of metal and glass stretched up to meet the alien sky, casting shadows across the barren landscape. Human ingenuity had transformed this once inhospitable moon into a bustling hub of research and resource extraction, all under the watchful eye of Professor Xel'Thor. Xel'Thor wasn't your typical educator, a being of translucent, shimmering skin and floating tendrils. His alien form was unsettling to many. His species, the Enril, were known across the galaxy for their advanced technologies and profound intellect. But what made Xel'Thor unique wasn't just his vast knowledge. It was his teaching style. Unpredictable, enigmatic, and often perplexing, his lessons didn't just challenge his students intellectually, they pushed them to their limits, testing their adaptability, creativity, and survival instincts. Max Carter wasn't one of Xel'Thor's star students. He wasn't the sharpest, nor the most innovative. But there was something about the professor's challenges that always spoke to Max. Practicality, simplicity, problem-solving. Max had grown up working with his hands, tinkering with broken machines and old tech. He was the kind of person who could fix something with spare parts, if only he had the right tools. That's what kept him going in the colony, his ability to adapt, to get things done. He wasn't interested in being the smartest, he just wanted to be useful. Today, however, was different. Today, Xel'Thor had announced a challenge that seemed almost impossible. Max walked into the lecture hall, his boots clanking against the metal floor. The room was filled with his fellow students, all seated at their stations, each one looking at the alien materials before them. The air buzzed with the usual low hum of nervous energy as they all prepared for whatever Xel'Thor had in mind today. The professor entered with his usual ethereal grace, floating over the floor like a ghost. His bioluminescent skin flickered as he moved, and his tendrils curled in strange, hypnotic patterns. Max knew that in a few minutes, the professor's voice would reverberate throughout the room, announcing something strange and daunting. He had come to expect the unexpected from Xel'Thor. "Today," Xel'Thor began, his voice echoing through the hall, "you will face the greatest test of all. A test not of intelligence, but of adaptability. The ability to create, to survive, and to make use of what is available." Max's ears perked up. He could tell that whatever came next was going to be another one of Xel'Thor's infamous exercises. He looked over at his classmates, who were all shifting in their seats, eager to know what the task would entail. "I have brought you here to teach you about shelter, specifically the art of constructing one in less than optimal conditions. You will be given 1 hour to build a shelter capable of withstanding the harshest of environments. A shelter that will protect you and only you. You are on your own." The students exchanged uneasy glances. The phrase harsh environments wasn't something they took lightly. They had studied the many worlds Xel'Thor had visited, worlds where gravity was so high that it crushed bones, and others where toxic storms ravaged the surface for centuries. They had trained for this. But this was different. They had no idea what kind of challenge Xel'Thor had prepared for them. Xel'Thor raised one of his tendrils, gesturing toward the array of materials laid out on each station. The tables were cluttered with a mix of alien polymers, human tools, and complex energy cores that hummed with unknown potential. "Your materials are limited. You may not use anything outside of what is provided. You will find that some of these materials are unfamiliar. Some may even appear impractical. But do not be deceived. You are being tested on how well you can utilize what is available to you." Max felt a familiar tension in his gut, the kind he always felt before a challenge. It wasn't fear, it was anticipation. He liked this feeling. It meant he had to think, act fast, and make decisions. "Now," Xel'Thor continued, "I will not offer guidance once the clock begins. You will have 1 hour to build your shelter. The challenge will end precisely in 1 hour. Any student who has not completed their shelter will be considered to have failed. The task is simple. Build something that could keep you alive for at least 72 hours in a hostile environment. Make it strong, make it functional, make it yours." A few students looked around, unsure how to approach the challenge. Some already began discussing strategies, while others sketched complex designs on their holopads. But Max wasn't concerned with blueprints or grand ideas. He was thinking about efficiency, simplicity. If he had learned anything in his time on Titan, it was that overcomplicating things could lead to failure. Xel'Thor's voice rang out again, more somber now. "I will be watching. You will learn not only from your successes, but from your failures. You will learn the most from your mistakes." Max's mind raced as the timer flashed on the screen. He was already planning what to do. The materials before him weren't ideal, but they were useful enough. A few broken metal sheets, a handful of thin, flexible polymer sheets, and a powerful but compact energy core. Max wasn't sure if the core would have any practical use, but it was worth investigating. The clock began ticking. Max immediately started moving, tearing through the polymer sheets to get the raw material he needed. Most of his classmates were still discussing designs, sketching on their tablets. Some had already begun folding the sheets into intricate, impossible-to-assemble shapes. He couldn't afford that kind of time. Max had one goal in mind: speed. He had learned long ago that when it came to survival, there was no room for hesitation, no time for indecision. You used what you had and worked with it. He grabbed a metal sheet and carefully shaped it into a makeshift wall. The polymer sheets would be used to create a protective outer layer, while the metal would form a solid frame. Max didn't need any fancy tools, just his hands and a quick mind. His shelter started to take shape faster than he expected. He used the magnetic properties of the materials to hold the pieces in place, combining his knowledge of basic engineering with the alien tech available to him. By the time half an hour had passed, Max's shelter was already starting to resemble a small, solid structure. It wasn't fancy, nor did it have the complex energy shielding that some of his classmates were incorporating, but it was functional. The frame was secure, and the outer layers were thick enough to protect from the harsh winds Titan was known for. He looked up for a moment, glancing around the room. Several of the other students were still stuck in the design phase, still discussing whether to use this polymer or that energy source. Xel'Thor was watching them closely, his tendrils twitching as if to signal that time was slipping away. Max smiled to himself. This was what he excelled at: getting things done, even if it wasn't pretty. The last 10 minutes were a blur. Max moved quickly, adding the final touches to his shelter. He reinforced the corners, added an emergency vent, and made sure the energy core was safely secured inside. He didn't know if it would work, but it didn't matter. He had built something. He had created a solution. Fast. When the timer beeped, Max stood back and surveyed his work. The shelter was small but sturdy, a compact structure made of metal and polymer that could fit one person comfortably. It wasn't perfect, but it was effective. And most importantly, it was done. Xel'Thor glided over to Max's station, his tendrils rippling in the air. The professor didn't speak at first, instead examining the shelter with his usual detachment. The room had fallen silent. Every student, including Max, was waiting for Xel'Thor's judgment. "This," Xel'Thor finally said, his voice soft, but carrying a tone of respect, is a most intriguing creation. Max looked up, not expecting a compliment. He had never thought of himself as a standout student, especially not in front of the Enril. But Xel'Thor was not one for simple praise. He didn't offer compliments often. You have built quickly and with purpose. The shelter is simple, but it will hold up under most conditions. You have followed my challenge. Efficiency over extravagance. You have proven that survival does not always require complexity. Max felt a strange sense of pride wash over him. For once, simplicity had won out over complexity. The other students, still working furiously on their own shelters, exchanged nervous glances. They had seen Max's shelter and they knew it was far simpler than their own elaborate designs. But the professor was impressed. This, Xel'Thor continued, turning to face the entire class, is the key to survival. Knowing when to simplify. Knowing when to discard the unnecessary and focus on the essential. Max exhaled slowly. He hadn't expected to win the challenge, but there was a lesson here. Sometimes the simplest answers were the best ones. Xel'Thor paused and turned back to Max. I will be watching your progress closely, Carter. Perhaps there is more to your method than I first realized. Max smiled, knowing that this was just the beginning. The discovery wasn't just about the shelter. It was about the way he approached the problem, and that, in the end, was what made the difference. Max Carter had spent his whole life on the edge. Born on a small colony on Mars, he'd learned early on that survival wasn't guaranteed, not even on a planet as familiar as his own. So, when he had signed up for the Titan colonization mission, he'd known exactly what he was getting into. The training had been rigorous and the challenges were endless, but none of it had prepared him for this. None of it had prepared him for Xel'Thor. The Enril were a species of intellectuals, beings so far beyond human understanding that even their simplest actions seemed to carry the weight of millennia of knowledge. They had mastered the art of survival in the harshest environments in the universe. Xel'Thor, the professor assigned to teach the first batch of human colonists on Titan, was as enigmatic as he was intimidating. His translucent, shimmering body seemed to defy the laws of physics, as though he existed on a different plane of existence. He was a living paradox, alien and yet not, possessing a mind that was both unfathomably advanced and almost childishly curious. When Max had first met Xel'Thor, he had felt an immediate connection. Not on an intellectual level, but on a more primal one. There was something about the way the professor approached problems that made Max think of his own childhood, when he'd spent hours taking apart machinery, learning how things worked and putting them back together again. Max didn't need to know how the parts were made, he just needed to know how to use them. Maximus' shelter was the first one to be completed. And though he hadn't been looking for validation, he was keenly aware of the surprise on his classmates' faces. The other students, who had spent the last 30 minutes debating the use of this material or that technique, were now looking at him with a mixture of disbelief and curiosity. They hadn't expected a human to finish so soon, especially not with something so straightforward. Xel'Thor floated closer to Max's shelter, his tendrils gracefully trailing behind him, casting shimmering shadows on the ground. The professor didn't speak right away. Instead, he ran a hand over the structure, sensing its stability, its weight, its design. Max could see his tendrils twitch slightly, as though deep in thought. "You've done something unusual," Xel'Thor said, finally breaking the silence. His voice echoed in the room like the hum of a distant star, and Max couldn't help but feel a strange pride swell in his chest. "This structure is unremarkable in its design, but highly functional. You focused on the basics. the most essential components. You've built to survive. Max couldn't tell if that was praise or a simple observation, but he was used to the way Xel'Thor spoke, his words often veiled with a mixture of admiration and critique. The professor wasn't interested in fluff or empty words. He didn't have time for niceties. There is something profound in simplicity, Xel'Thor continued, his tone lingering in the air. You've taken the bare minimum and made it work. Efficiency, this is the hallmark of a truly adaptable species. Max nodded but said nothing. He wasn't interested in talking about the shelter. He was just glad it had held up to the professor's scrutiny. It was more than he'd hoped for, and that was enough for now. Xel'Thor drifted back to the center of the room, and the rest of the students returned to their workstations. Some seemed shaken, others inspired, but all were keenly aware that they had a long way to go. The challenge had only just begun. Max didn't linger. The other students were already muttering to each other about how to refine their designs. He knew there would be plenty of time for post-challenge analysis later. For now, he had his shelter to focus on. His simple, sturdy structure. It would keep him alive, and that was all he needed to know. As he sat down, wiping sweat from his brow, he glanced over at the large viewing screen that displayed the countdown timer. 45 minutes remained. But as Max looked down at the shelter he'd built, a thought nagged at him. He'd built it to survive. But there was more to survival than just keeping out the elements. The professor's words, efficiency, simplicity, seemed to echo in his mind. Maybe there was something more here, something that he hadn't yet discovered. Max stood and approached his shelter, running his fingers along its metal frame. He'd used the simplest design possible, quick to assemble, low on energy, high on utility. But what if there was more? What if he could make it better? The other students were focused on making their shelters complex, energy shields, advanced air filtration, multi-layered walls. They were overcomplicating the task, missing the point entirely. But what if he could add just one more layer to his shelter, something that would make it truly versatile? He walked over to one of the workstations where the remaining materials sat. The polymer sheets were lightweight but strong, and the energy core, though small, could generate enough power to fuel a force field if used correctly. Max wasn't interested in fancy gadgets or high-tech frills. But the energy core, that could be useful. The ability to generate a low-level shield or force field would help in extreme environments, like the harsh radiation storms Titan was known for. Max bent over the energy core, studying it carefully. He had no experience with energy shields. He had barely scratched the surface of the technology. But he understood basic principles of energy manipulation. It was about understanding how to harness power, not necessarily understanding the theoretical physics behind it. He'd always been a hands-on learner, and that's what he was going to do now. Learn by doing. He carefully attached the core to the side of his shelter, using the available wiring and polymers to connect it. As he worked, he felt his heart rate increase. This wasn't part of the challenge. He wasn't supposed to be adding new components. But there was something about it that felt right. Something about the way the energy core hummed softly as he connected it made him feel as if he were on the verge of discovering something incredible. With the last connection made, Max stepped back. He activated the core, holding his breath. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, a faint shimmer appeared around the shelter. The thin force field flickered into existence, casting a soft, bluish glow around the structure. Max exhaled, a grin spreading across his face. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Enough to protect him from environmental hazards, enough to keep him safe from whatever Titan might throw at him. Just then, Xel'Thor's voice rang out. 30 minutes remaining. Max stood up, his heart pounding in his chest. He had no idea if the professor had noticed what he'd done, but it didn't matter. He knew that this wasn't about winning or losing. It was about learning, experimenting, and discovering. This was a test of adaptability, and Max was doing just that. The next half hour passed in a blur of activity. Max didn't waste any time. He was in the zone now, focused entirely on perfecting his shelter. He adjusted the shield's energy output, ensuring it wouldn't drain the core too quickly. He reinforced the structure, adding a few extra layers of polymer just in case. He wasn't about to sit back and rest on his laurels. This was a challenge, and he wasn't done yet. When the timer finally went off, Xel'Thor's voice echoed throughout the room, signaling the end of the challenge. "Time is up. Your shelters are complete." Max stepped back from his shelter, sweat still dripping down his face. He couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. It wasn't perfect, but it was functional. It was simple, effective, and adaptable, a testament to the philosophy that Xel'Thor had instilled in him. The professor's eyes were now focused on the students, his tendrils moving in quick, sharp motions as he analyzed each shelter. Xel'Thor floated toward Max's shelter first, his tendrils reaching out to touch the shimmering shield. The force field flickered briefly under his touch but remained intact. "You've done something unconventional," Xel'Thor said, his voice laced with curiosity. "You've taken what was already built and enhanced it. This is no longer a simple shelter. It is a living system, a reactive structure. You've made it capable of defending itself." Max looked up, his breath still heavy. He hadn't expected this kind of praise. He had simply been experimenting, trying to make something more functional. "You've taken the concept of adaptability to its next stage. You've demonstrated that survival isn't just about static solutions. It's about creating something that can evolve and react to its environment." Max didn't know what to say. The professor was acknowledging something he hadn't even considered. He had created something that could grow, something that could change in response to the environment. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't the most advanced design, but it was his own. As the other students filed out of the room, Xel'Thor lingered for a moment, his tendrils swirling in contemplation. "Carter, your approach. It may prove to be more valuable than I initially thought. There is potential in you, not just in your skills, but in your way of thinking. Continue to push the boundaries of what you know." Max stood there, his heart still racing. It wasn't about winning or being the best. It was about discovering something new, something that could change everything. "Now ready? Now, go." As the professor left the room, Max stood quietly, his eyes drifting back to his shelter. It wasn't the most beautiful structure, but it was his. And that, he realized, was all that mattered. The sound of heavy boots clanking against the metallic floor echoed through the hallway as Max Carter walked through the dimly lit corridors of the Titan colony. His mind was buzzing with thoughts from the previous day's challenge. He'd built something simple, practical even, but Xel'Thor had recognized it as something more, something that could evolve, something that could react to an environment. Max didn't consider himself an academic or an expert in alien technology, but that day had shifted something deep inside him. He had always been the type of person who thrived on solving problems, small, manageable ones. But this challenge had opened up a new world, not just about surviving, but about the potential of human adaptability in an alien context. It had been just a few hours since the competition ended, but already Max felt like his understanding of what was possible had shifted dramatically. He wasn't just a student anymore. He was a creator. As he rounded the corner and entered the student dormitory area, He saw a few of his classmates talking amongst themselves in hushed tones, their eyes flickering toward him as he walked by. Most of them still seemed rattled from the challenge. They had all been so focused on building complex, high-tech designs, relying on their knowledge of advanced materials, energy fields, and alien tech. Meanwhile, Max had focused on the simplest solution, and it had worked. He was used to being underestimated. It had happened his whole life. People had always seen him as just another engineer, just another mechanic, just another kid from Mars who barely passed the colonization tests. He was often overlooked in favor of his more theoretically inclined peers who excelled at memorizing complex formulas or mastering intricate alien concepts. But Max had learned long ago that real-world problems didn't care about theories. They only cared about solutions. Max's dorm room was small but functional. There was a single bed pushed against one wall, a small desk cluttered with tools and schematics from various projects, and a window that gave him a glimpse of Titan's dark sky. The atmosphere of Titan was thick, the orange glow of distant stars casting an eerie light over the moon's surface. It was a beautiful but desolate sight, and Max found solace in it. The colony was small, only a few hundred humans living alongside a handful of alien researchers and scientists, but it felt like home. Max had lived here long enough to realize that the real challenges weren't just about surviving the alien world outside. The real challenge was learning how to exist alongside species that were so vastly different from humanity. The Enril were incredibly advanced, beings of intellect and power who had traversed the stars for millennia, but they viewed things from a completely different perspective. They didn't see human fragility, they saw adaptability, and to Xel'Thor that adaptability was what truly mattered. He thought back to their conversation at the end of the challenge. Xel'Thor had made it clear that Max's approach was an anomaly. While the others had focused on building things that were technologically impressive, Max had built something that was merely functional. But that function was more than enough. The professor had been impressed not because of the technology involved, but because of the way Max had thought about the problem. Simple, direct, efficient. Max had taken something he had learned from years of tinkering with human machinery and applied it to alien resources in a way that no one else had thought to do. His solution wasn't elegant, but it was effective. Max ran a hand through his hair, still marveling at the way Xel'Thor had praised him. The professor wasn't one for compliments, and yet, for a brief moment, he had shown genuine respect for Max's way of thinking. But that respect hadn't come without a cost. Max knew that now. The challenge had only been the beginning. The professor had recognized his potential, yes, but now Xel'Thor would expect more. The Enril were not interested in mediocrity. They never had been. Xel'Thor had already seen that Max was capable of more. He had opened a door, and Max had no idea what lay on the other side. The following week passed in a blur of lectures, drills, and practical exercises. Max's shelter had been the talk of the colony, with many of his classmates struggling to understand how he had managed to pull it off. Some even asked him for advice, but Max was careful to avoid too much discussion about his design. He knew that his peers were still recovering from the shock of his unexpected success. And he was fine with that. He didn't need their praise. What he needed was to stay focused on what came next. It wasn't until the second week after the challenge that Xel'Thor approached him in class, his translucent form casting a soft glow in the darkened lecture hall. The room fell silent as the professor floated toward the front. "Carter," Xel'Thor's voice boomed, "you've displayed a remarkable understanding of adaptability. You are not only capable of reacting to your environment, you can shape it. This is a skill that few species possess." Max didn't know how to respond. He had never been good at accepting praise, especially when it felt like he hadn't done anything extraordinary. To him, his shelter had been the most basic solution to a simple problem. But to Xel'Thor, it was something more. "I have been watching your progress closely," Xel'Thor continued, "and I believe you are ready for a new challenge." Max felt his heart race. "What kind of challenge?" he asked, his voice steady despite the sudden rise of anxiety in his chest. The professor's tendrils swirled in the air like liquid light as he considered Max's question. "You have shown that you are capable of designing a simple yet effective shelter, but now you must think bigger. I will provide you with a new set of materials, some alien, some human, made. Your task will be to create a structure capable of sustaining life for a week in one of the most hostile environments in the galaxy." Max's mind raced. A week? One of the most hostile environments? He had no idea what Xel'Thor had in mind, but he wasn't about to back down from the challenge. "You will be given only 1 day," Xel'Thor added, his voice taking on a more serious tone. "Your shelter must not only protect from physical harm, but also provide for the basic needs of life. It must have an air filtration system, a temperature regulation system, and an energy supply that will last the entire duration of the test." Max's stomach tightened as he processed the details. A shelter that could last a week in the harshest environment? He didn't even know what kind of environment they were talking about. The challenges he had faced so far had been difficult, but this one was different. This wasn't about surviving a storm. This was about surviving in an unknown, potentially lethal condition. The stakes were higher than ever. "I understand," Max said, his voice quieter than usual. "When do we start?" "You begin immediately," Xel'Thor replied. "I will provide the materials, but the design, the execution, and the success of your shelter are entirely up to you. Fail, and you will learn what true failure is. Succeed, and you will have learned something that will change your understanding of what it means to survive." Max didn't need to be told twice. He was already thinking ahead, formulating plans, identifying what resources he had to work with. He didn't know where the test would take place or what the environment would be like, but he did know one thing. He would approach it the same way he had approached the shelter challenge. Simple, effective, adaptable. Xel'Thor's final words echoed in his mind as he began to gather his materials. Survival is not just about building, it is about understanding, about discovery. The following days were a whirlwind. Xel'Thor had provided the students with a collection of materials unlike anything Max had ever seen before. Some of them were familiar, like the polymer sheets and metal alloys that had been used in the previous challenge. Others were completely alien. Materials that seemed to change form and structure at will, responding to heat and pressure in ways that defied the laws of physics. Max had no idea how he was going to use them, but that didn't matter. He was resourceful and he would find a way. As he worked tirelessly on his shelter, making adjustments and testing new configurations, his mind kept returning to Xel'Thor's words: discovery, understanding, survival. Each word felt like a clue, a piece of a puzzle that Max was starting to understand. It wasn't just about building something to withstand the elements. It was about creating a structure that could evolve, just as he had done before. Max's fingers flew across the materials as he worked. He didn't stop to second-guess himself. He didn't have time for that. The countdown clock was ticking and he had to finish. It wasn't just his survival at stake. It was his understanding of what he was capable of. Hours passed in a blur, and soon Max was standing in front of his completed shelter. It was compact, like before, but this time it had a few more features. An internal filtration system, energy cores that would last for a week, and the ability to adapt to the environment outside. He had no idea what the test would involve, but he knew his shelter was ready. As the challenge day arrived, Max felt a strange sense of calm. The colony was buzzing with activity as students prepared for the trial. Xel'Thor stood at the center of the testing area, his glowing tendrils dancing in the light. "Your time has come," he announced. "Enter the test site. Show me what you have learned." Max nodded. He was ready, and for the first time in his life he felt as though he truly understood what survival meant. The test site was unlike anything Max had ever experienced. It was an isolated section of Titan's surface, a region untouched by the colony's technology. The winds howled and the temperature plummeted to sub-zero levels. The ground was cracked and uneven, and the air was thick with a strange, toxic gas. Max's shelter stood firm, responding immediately to the environment. The temperature regulation systems kicked in, and the filtration system hummed to life, clearing the air of harmful particles. The energy cores powered the shelter's systems, and the walls shifted slightly to adapt to the changing winds. Max stood inside, watching as the storm outside raged on. It was harsh, but it wasn't impossible. His shelter had done its job. It had protected him. It had survived. As the test concluded, Xel'Thor appeared before him, his tendrils swaying with a sense of approval. "You have succeeded, Carter, but more than that, you have learned. You have understood what it means to adapt, to evolve." Max smiled. This wasn't just about building shelters. This was about discovering what he was truly capable of. And in that discovery, Max had learned that survival wasn't just about living through a storm. It was about understanding the storm, becoming part of it, and using it to your advantage.